David is out there with a small army in the deserts of South Judah. They basically almost become a semi-independent state themselves. The government structures of Israel were in its early infant days, and including amongst this little semi-independent state in South Judah. It was a place of lack of control, chaos, a place where there was enemies all about, whether it be bandits or whether it be opposing armies and tribes going back and forth. Even 1,000 years later, by the time we get to the New Testament, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan about somebody who tries to travel through this wilderness and gets beat up and left for dead. In the Old Testament days, in the days of David, it was even more chaotic. David and his men, his little army, were providing a type of government and a semi-legal protection service. At least if you want to put a positive spin on it. It was a protection racket, if you want to give it the negative spin. Many were benefiting, including a gentleman by the name of Nabal. David was keeping the Philistines and the bandits away. And he was helping out, at least his army was, helping out with farm workers wherever they could. David himself and his little army are secure at this moment. The king of the Israelites, Saul, the great enemy to David and his army, he's happy at the moment. He's off in his capital city of Gibeah. He's fighting other people. He's recently had his life saved by David, so he's not chasing David at this moment. Nabal is a wealthy farmer. Pronounce his name various ways. You say Nabal, whatever you want to call him. He's one of the wealthiest landowners. He's a great beneficiary of David. Now, the first thing you note when you're looking at his life is that name. In Hebrew, his name means fool, is how we've traditionally said it. It might have a little bit more of an edge to it. Really, in the Hebrew, you can call him almost the idiot. And I kind of look at that, and I first ask, what kind of mother did he have? Who names their kid Fool? I wonder if it's more of a nickname or a shortened form of something else, because I can't imagine what mother would do this. He's clearly a good business person. He has a huge flock. He is a part of a historic, powerful Hebrew family. He's a descendant of one of the great heroes of the early parts of the Bible, a gentleman by the name of Caleb. He lives in the Carmel region of Judah. Now, if you happen to be a little bit of a trivia person, you may have heard of Mount Carmel, which is an important site later in the Old Testament, not the same place. That was a mountain in northern Israel. This is a town in the very far southern reaches of Israel. It was sheep shearing time when the story takes place. That's a big moment. All of a sudden, there's money because we brought in the wool. And it's a great time for a big celebration. Get everybody together and have a big party. David gets this idea. We've shared with you. We've helped you. Maybe it's time for you to share with us. And so he sends 10 young men to Nabal. They greet him. They bless him. And they have the question. David asks, can you share some of your blessing with us as payment? Now we need to understand right away. This is a form of taxation. A very common in that era way of doing things. But taxes were no more popular then than they are today. And when somebody comes and asks, can you pay up? You're not going to get a lot of enthusiasm. Nabal responds, who is this David? Now, he knows. There's no way he doesn't know. We certainly get that from the next couple of things that come. Who is this son of Jesse? It was a name that King Saul used in a derogatory tone about David whenever he's trying to insult him. Clearly, he says he doesn't know David, but he knows David's father. So obviously he knew him. He's trying to insult him. Probably this David is just some runaway slave who's fled his master. The wilderness is full of people like that. There's a tiny bit of truth in that. He's fled Saul. We can miss in the translations here how much of an insult there is. He is very deliberately trying to get his digs in on David. He's ridiculed. The very person who would be protecting him, the very one who had sent his men to help his workers. The 10 men return to David. They bring the insult to him, and David flies off the handle. David is infuriated. He's got 600 men at his beck and call, and he says, okay, I want 200 of you to stay behind and guard our stuff. 400 of you, we're going to go teach this guy a lesson. Go grab your weapons. We're leaving as fast as we can. This is massive overkill, 400 people to attack one farm. But David is angry. This is 1 Samuel 25. I think we're supposed to put that up there already. Just to make sure we've all got the right passage. 1 Samuel 25. If you were with us last week, we looked at 1 Samuel 23, 24. We skipped this chapter and we looked at 26. In 1 Samuel 23, 24, and later in 26, David is treated poorly. And he responds with compassion. He responds properly, shows Christ-like response. And in 25, he fails miserably. Here in the middle of some victorious stories, we have David fly off the handle. Even the hero can fall. Even somebody as remarkable as David can fail and lose his temper. That's why we need to humbly, continually, daily come back to God. In the earlier stories, the last couple of chapters, David consulted with God and then went off and did what he was told to do. Not here. Not it. Everybody, I'm angry. Get your sword. Let's go get him. It's a completely different story than the ones before and right after this. Author Ellen Redpath, on his book about David, writes this. David, what is wrong with you? Why? One of the most wonderful things we've learned about you recently is your patience with King Saul. You learned to wait upon the Lord. But now look at you. Your self-restraint has gone to pieces, and a few insulting words from a fool of a man like Nabal has made you see red. David, what is the matter? Then he gives David's response. I love this. I think it's a great way to phrase it. I am justified in doing this, David would reply. And in many ways, David, perhaps from a human point of view, was justified. Paul as insulted as his goodness in front of all of his men. He's ruined David's plans for helping people. And in this moment, David has given up control of his own actions. That's what a temper does. I'm giving up control of myself to the person who has insulted me. I have an observational stat. That's a little bit different than an official stat, I guess. It's just how I see things. In 30 years now of pastoring, there's rarely a week that goes by that somebody doesn't come to me and either talk to me about somebody's temper, or at least ask me, can you pray for my spouse, child, my parent, my uncle, aunt, grandpa, or maybe beyond family for a boss, a coworker who's having a temper problem. That's about roughly 50 people a year coming to me saying, I'm struggling because somebody else has a temper problem. I'm affected because of somebody else's temper. And you know what? About once a year, approximately, somebody will come to me saying, I need to talk to you, or I need you to pray because I struggle with a temper. You catch a difference there. 50 times a year, I'll get somebody come to me saying, somebody's got a temper issue, and I'll get one out of the 50 who will come to me saying, I'm struggling. That's kind of scary, actually. It's hard to fix it when I've got all these people who are struggling because somebody's got a temper, and only one wants the fix. Psalm 14. It's a remarkable psalm. It's of David. We don't know entirely when, but I can kind of picture it from this story, because it fits when he says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. Sorry, losing my voice there. There is none who does good. Fool! We just said that's what Nabal's name means. But I kind of think in many ways when David is writing this, he's almost thinking of himself. The fool says in his heart. Now we immediately read this, and we superimpose modern atheism on this verse, and it fits absolutely 100%, but that's not what David really is thinking here. As we go through the rest of the chapter, we're going to do just a couple little bits of it, but he's clearly thinking of somebody who in his heart is saying God is not part of my story right now. God does not apply to what's going on in my life right now. God does not apply to what I'm struggling with. And he's the fool. And I think David is very much including himself in this verse, that he's treating God as irrelevant as he's getting ready to attack. That the rule of God, the things that God says in command, they don't apply today. They don't apply in my situation. And in verse 2 he says that God looks around to see who is doing good. And in verse 3, they have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. In other words, we all have different struggles. But we all have struggles. We're all in the same camp. I mean, I'll fly off the handle and get 400 men and attack my enemies, but I can struggle. And David is pointing out, in those moments of struggle, God is still relevant. David, it's grab your sword, let's go. Nabal is a fool, but David is being violent here. Last week, if you're with us, again, you can find the sermon online, it was all about David calming things down. And here it is, let's escalate things. Let's make things worse. While I've got this burning anger in my heart. Don't try to stop me and let me cool down. Don't try to quiet things down. The psalm ends with what should have been David's desire from the beginning. Oh, that salvation for Israel will come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad. There's another character in this story. Her name is Abigail. Her name means something like, my father is joyful. Well, that sounds like a happy name. Abigail. She's married to Nabal. And the servants of the household, the workers in the farmyard, they come and they tell her what's going on. That your husband has insulted this guy who's pretty powerful. And he's somebody who's helped us, who's looked after us, who we need. And so she swings into action. She grabs a reward for David. She gets 200 loaves of bread. And this is quite the household. Who has 200 loaves of bread lying around? She does. She gets 2 wineskins, 5 prepared sheets. She gets grain, raisins, fig cakes, and sends them off with her servants saying, I'm going to be right behind you. And she rides out quickly and arrives to David and falls down before him. And she cries out, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. What a remarkable person. Most of us in moments of chaos, our first words are, it's somebody else's fault. It was her husband's fault, really, when you get down. But she takes responsibility over the problem. It's my fault. I missed your men's visit. My husband, yes, he's earned his name of a fool on this one. And she goes on and gives a wonderful speech. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she blesses David. She seeks God's blessing on her own household. And she apologizes. And when she's done that, she apologizes some more. And then she gives her primary purpose in going to see David. And this is critical. I am here to keep you from sin. I am here to keep you from doing what is wrong, David. David is in the wilderness. It's kind of a refuge. Why is he there? He's been anointed as king long before. But he needs to learn to be a different kind of king than Saul. He's there to learn lessons, how to be a man after God's own heart. And here, he's not learning the lesson. He's being like Saul. He's going for his vengeance. When somebody's insulted him, he will pay them back. And this solitary woman shows up in the wilderness. You are meant to be royal. You are meant to be different than the fool. You are meant to be different than the king who is on the throne now. She's in control of her emotion. She speaks with tact. And she shows great loyalty to David, yes, and to her husband at the same time. She saves the day by telling David that there will be consequences to her actions. To his actions, sorry. When anger burns, sometimes it comes out as a fiery temper. For some, it comes out more as I go off in my room and I feel sorry for myself. Others go around and they gossip to people and try to get people to feel sorry for them. All those are versions. The same thing when emotion controls who I am. And whatever anger does to us, we tend to hold on to it. We tend to nurse that emotion because somehow anger allows me to feel justified about my own shortcomings, that look, somebody's worse than I am. And it keeps me from dealing with my own sin. It keeps me from dealing with my own shortcomings and struggles. And so often we care more about our anger than the consequences of anger. This keeps our eyes squarely on this world and not on heaven above. So Abigail shows up and she gets David back on track. She keeps him from doing wrong. And the bottom line, and we see this in the warnings, she keeps David from potential disaster. Are you going to act like Saul? Are you going to be like Nabal? Or will you be the person whom God has called you to be? Quite the response. David says this when Abigail shows up. His first words, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand." Somebody chastises me. I gotta be honest, worship is not usually the first things to come out of my mouth. Somebody comes to me and says, "You're wrong." Usually it's not worship. He's being moved from anger to worship. He's trying to fix the problem, bringing salvation with my own hands. I'm trying to fix what I should be waiting upon God. I need to learn to focus on a remarkable God. David recognizes that he's been given this incredible, this great gift. And it's in the form of a rebuke. It's in the form of correction. And it saves him from disaster. David learns, I think in this moment, he learns it multiple times. He's going to have to relearn this lesson multiple times, but he learns to be vigilant against sin, against things that focus his eyes on what's going on that's wrong. You know what? That can be really, really hard at certain moments. Like when stress is high. When I'm tired. Honestly, when I'm hungry. Those become the moments where my guard is down. Those become the moments when I let sin creep in. Somebody says something to me and emotions grow. And those become the moments when I'm not as vigilant about sin. When I'm deeply offended. Man, I can nurse that offense, as we all can. Those are moments when we either fall the hardest or when we find great victory. Chapter before this, chapter 24. Chapter after this, chapter 26. There's a big gap there. There are the two stories of Saul attacking David, and David having the opportunity to kill Saul, and he lets him off the hook. A lot of people look at this and try to put the chronology of David's life together, and they figure probably about 16 to 18 months pass. In those months, in which David is basically the king of a semi-independent state in south of Judah, we have one story that's recorded in the Bible. We don't have any stories of his victories. We don't have any stories of battle. We don't have any stories of him going out and worship or anything like that. One story the Bible thinks we need from this era of time is David's failure. Why do we need a story of a hero's failure? Maybe because we can all relate at some point. And we need to be able to understand in this moment that David fails, and yet he's honest about it, he recognizes it, and he turns it into a moment of worship. Nabal is acting this way. And David's learning, maybe I don't have it together as much as I thought I did, but that's okay because I've still got a good God. I have still got a God who's at work in my life. And isn't that incredible? Psalm 37, I read that at the very beginning of the sermon, just a little piece of it, said I'd come back to it. Psalm 37 is another story, or a psalm of David's life. We don't know exactly when it's written, but traditionally it's been attached to this story. It starts off, fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers. This advice that he is learning. Do not let others control your agenda or control you. Then he says, trust in the Lord and do good. This is in the midst of evildoers working. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Goes into a wonderful little bit about committing yourself to God and being fully committed to God in all ways. And then in verse 7, he picks it up. Be still. How would this story be different? David's flying off the handle and he says, Let's pray. Let's commit ourselves again to Jesus. Still before the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Don't fret there. Commit your ways to God instead. In verse 8, refrain from anger. Forsake wrath. Fret not yourself. It tends only to evil. Catch the end there. That end little piece. In your anger against the wicked, you are tending to the garden of evil. You are helping it to grow. David has been given a great gift, and he's learned a remarkable lesson. Psalm 37 here. It's quite a lengthy psalm, and go and read it. It's worth reading. There's a whole lot more to this story. The chapter goes on. I'm going to give you the quick overview, just so you know where we're at. Abigail goes back to her husband and discovers that the wild party is still going on, and he's drunk. Can't talk with him. Wakes up the next morning, and she goes and tells him how close he came to disaster. The best we can figure out medically from this story is he has a stroke, and he lies there for a week and a half, and then God takes him. Being a widow in that era was, you were very vulnerable. And so David, as a distant relative, there's some laws in which he can take her into his home as a wife and protect her. And he does that. He claims her as a kinsman redeemer. And so she goes back and becomes David's bride. At that moment, the scripture breaks in and tells us this odd little bit that, of course, he had a wife, Abigail, daughter of the king, made David the son-in-law of the king. Saul had forced her to divorce David and had given her away to a new husband. We're going to come back to that story later because David's going to get rid of that other husband. Anyways, we'll save that for another day. We also discovered David has married somebody else in the wilderness. Again, we're going to deal with all his wives at a later date. Hang on. I don't get bogged down there right now. But the bottom line is this. The story ends well. David does well. David brings in this woman he needs to have compassion on her, who's a distant relative. He shows her love. At the same time, he would have inherited the great wealth of this farm. And so that doesn't hurt either. God is still at work. Entering into David's story at times is inspiring, and at times it kind of makes you think. And that's my goal today, is maybe make us think. Okay, he's dealing with somebody who's done him wrong. Really has done wrong. He's insulted him. He's downgraded his house in front of all of his men. And yet, somehow, in the end, because of some work of Abigail, he's not going to let this evil control his agenda. Times we can be set off in anger. And it's easy to focus on sheer emotion rather than obedience to God. It is so easy to say, I was justified to do wrong. I was mad, I was angry, I was justified to do wrong. I did not need to obey God in that moment. At times we act in emotion and we set aside the scriptural warning and we act on mere instinct. And David learns and he calls to us, be still and know that I am God. And when I do that, it might be really hard because it's natural to act on sheer instinct. Maybe what I love about this story most is David just being admonished, taking up somebody else's warning. I'm going to hear that I'm doing wrong, and I'm going to listen, because that is a hard lesson. We need to be people who are humble to understand this. And so the call on us is to look at ourselves as sinners in desperate, desperate need of a Savior. I'm going to conclude by singing a song about being humble